So, gathered this. Well, we're going to be talking about jolly old Saint Nick today. Before we get going, I had this whole spiel about what I was going to share, my experiences of Santa Claus, but I'm bored by that. I already know what I thought about Santa Claus, what my family thought about Santa Claus. I'm more interested in hearing from you. What did you grow up hearing about Santa? Was it positive? Was it negative? Was it in the middle? And oh, after the Depression, you heard, "Oh, we can't afford Santa Claus." A lump of coal, maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Other folks. Yep. Santa Claus was wonderful, spiritual, exciting. Yeah. Good. Rita? Giving person, shared, would receive messages. Yep, shared. Yeah. Did anybody grow up with like Rankin Bass Santa Claus? You know, the claymation stuff? Yeah. Wait, did somebody say, okay. Okay. Did your children grow up with Rankin Bass? All right. That's the claymation stuff where they all, yeah. Rudolph, red-nosed reindeer, all of that. All right. Sounds like I am going to have to share some of my experiences here. My family didn't really know what to do with Santa Claus. At first, they were quite content for us to have this happy-go-lucky guy in our Christmas traditions. And this is exactly how we pictured him. This very Coca-Cola version of Santa, right? He's going to totally fall over again. I should have brought the stands. Somebody asked, is that Brio's? No, that's mine. That's my Santa. And then we went to a church where it wasn't okay to have Santa in your Christmas traditions. In fact, it was him to as Satan Claus. It was an example of how society wants to take Christ out of Christmas. I'm sure you've heard that before. And so we didn't really know what to do at that point. I mean, if the church is saying it, then it has to be wrong. But this is one of those early aspects, I think, in my family's history where they defied the norm of the spiritual community. It was kind of what I think of as a sacred act of differentiation. And they decided, you know what? We like that goofy gnome of a guy. Comes in through our chimneys with his 8 flying reindeer plus Rudolph. And they decided to keep Santa around. Now, to many, Santa is a harmless, even inspiring example. Do have a bone to pick with the guy. All right, you go over here. He knows he's getting a talking to right now. That's what it is. I do have a bone to pick with him. And it's because here in the U.S., he's just so synonymous with the commercialism of the holiday season. He's been used to hawk just about everything this time of year, right? In the aisles, selling stuff. He's on the TV. He's in movies, selling movies, you know. The Santa Claus is a great example. How many other movies are just filled with Santa? And in those movies. The problem is Santa might not be able to deliver those Christmas gifts, and we all know what that means. If he can't deliver the presents, Christmas can't happen. What? Some of us had to celebrate Christmas during the Depression. Did it still happen? Barely. Okay, but it but it did happen. Just almost by the skin of its teeth. Now, Santa triggers these nostalgic memories, and that's powerful marketing fuel. Nostalgia is one of those things that we often don't recognize, it's being triggered in us until it's happening. Like when we put up a Christmas tree, we have all these memories flood back. Well, Santa does the same kind of thing for a lot of us. But Santa also makes us, can inspire us to buy things to put smiles on the faces of the kiddos in our lives. Scott Nyglick, who is a former line manager for Mattel Toys, he was in charge of lines for DC and for He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. He says that the job of their marketing department is not on the toys, but to sell grown-ups on the toys. I think there's a little bit of a problem with my mic. Let's just run this one. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So there we are. I'm hearing myself a lot clearer now. They're in the business of selling good feelings. And we want to feel good by making the kids in our lives feel good, right? And so we buy toys to put a smile on their face. And then we have those endorphins kick in on Christmas Day, right? Oh, I'm glad they liked it. Or we have that crushing feeling of, oh no, they hate it, right? And I'm just as susceptible to this marketing as anybody else. Stephanie will tell you that. And this is not the kind of joy that we commemorate every third week of Advent. No, this joy that we light the candle for, it goes beyond any gift that we can give or receive in the Christmas tree or in a stocking. And it's seen most vividly in the Beatitudes. Now, in this passage, Jesus speaks to blessings from God to others, and the recipients of these blessings are unlikely people. Folks that we may not necessarily see as particularly blessed at first glance. Now, this word, blessed, it's commonly used to mean happy or joyful. And I've come to think of it as having cause for joy or having cause for celebration. And I'm going to break down what these are. It'll take a whole nother sermon to really flesh these out, but I want to touch on these briefly. Because the meaning that a lot of us receive from just the language that's in most of our translations, it doesn't go deep enough. So I just want to flesh these out a bit. Blessed are the brokenhearted. The brokenhearted. For theirs is the beloved community of God that Jesus proclaims, which can be experienced now, but echoes into eternity. Blessed are those who grieve. They will be comforted. It's implied in here that God will be their comforter. Blessed are those who've been pushed to the margins, who have been dispossessed of land, housing, and resources.
in the future that Jesus sees, the earth belongs to them. The future belongs to them. Blessed are those who yearn and cry out for justice. They will be satisfied. In the world that Jesus sees, these people who hunger and thirst, our text says righteousness, but it's the same word as justice. Those who hunger and thirst for justice, they're going to be filled. That's a world I want to live in. Blessed are those who care more about needs being met than some deserving criteria being met. They, too, will be shown mercy. Blessed are those who hold integrity. They are consistent even within themselves. That's what it means to be pure of heart. They will see God. They will experience God. Blessed are those who join God in the work of mending what is broken in our world. Those peacemakers will be seen to take after their heavenly parents. Last, blessed are those persecuted for justice. Why? Because they belong to God's beloved community. This passage is so deep. It's one of my favorites. We could spend our whole lives pursuing solidarity with these blessed folks and also recognizing, maybe being encouraged by those times when we get a taste of our own blessedness when we fall into these categories, despite our circumstances. This is the joy that we should be pursuing. Less Coca-Cola Santa and more Saint Nick. Shoot, I want to wander around, but did you see that? All right, I'm going to stay here. Nicholas was the precursor to Santa. It comes from the Dutch pronunciation for Saint Nicholas, Sinterklaas. Those of you with the Dutch backgrounds can correct me afterwards. Now, he lived from the year 270 through 343. This is very early in Christian history. We know very little about the historical Nicholas, despite the fact that he was the most popular saint in Europe for the better part of Christian history. Part of this is because folks who just lived during this era, they were trying to survive like anybody else. The position of bishop was not one filled with a lot of the clouts and a lot of the earning potential and importance that it came to in later church history. In fact, St. Nicholas is alive during this major transition point for the Roman Empire and for the church. So most of what we have about St. Nick comes from these sources around the year 500 or so. So we're talking about 200 years after Nicholas lived. And as you can imagine, a lot of embellishments come in during this time. And I'm going to do my best not to speak too much about those. So if you're expecting your favorite story of St. Nicholas to come up, it might not be mentioned. If your favorite story of St. Nicholas is the time that he found I'm going to try to say this in the most safe for work kind of way. If your favorite story of St. Nicholas is when he found and resurrected the 3 little boys who were being pickled by a butcher, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get to it today. Yeah, that one is a doozy. If your favorite story of St. Nicholas is the time that his statue ran and won a race, I'm not going to get to that one today. Or if it's about the time that he teleported onto a ship and then calmed a violent tempest, I'm not going to get to that one either. But we are going to get to these other ones. We'll touch on what we know about his life. What we know about his life. So take it with a grain of salt. St. Nicholas was born to Greek Christian parents and what we think of as modern-day Turkey today. We believe that they are Christian parents because he's one of the few saints who don't have some amazing, elaborate conversion story. His uncle was the Bishop of Mura and ended up ordaining Nick at a very young age because of all the promise he saw in him. Now, like a lot of wealthy kids, Nick decided to go on a gap year, or 2 or 3. We don't know how long he was traveling, but he made a pilgrimage over to Palestine and over to Egypt, and he lived in those places for a while. When he returned home, his uncle and then his uncle's successor had died, and so he was the ordained bishop. It is said that he was a very benevolent and just leader. He did what he could as a champion of the people. And throughout his lifetime, he made it a mission to give away all of his wealth. He was alive during one of the very few empire-wide Christian persecutions. We think of these as always being empire-wide and always raging, but most of the time there were regional events happening. But this was one of the most severe ones, the Diocletian persecution, in which hundreds and hundreds of Christians were tortured, imprisoned, and murdered. And he is said to have been caught up in that as well. He was incarcerated for decades until Constantine rose to power, had a conversion experience, and then legalized Christianity. After that, with the last 5 years of his life, the most notable thing that we have regarding him, and I'm going to try to make this quick for those of you who might be dozing off. You're like, this is the History Channel, but without the, ancient alien stuff. So get to the point, Giuseppe. Oh, I'm working on it. He was a part of the Council of Nicaea. If that is striking a chord for you, if you're like, I've heard of that before, that is one of the most important councils in which a bunch of Christian leaders got together and said, hey, let's create creeds that everybody has to agree to, and if they don't agree to them, then they're not a Christian. And they did this upon the urging of Constantine, who was frustrated with the great diversity of thought within Christianity. So this person over here, they believe this, and they believe this over here. You guys need to get your act together. And the council is like, all right, well, now that you guys aren't murdering us, I guess we can do that. So he was present for that. But if your favorite St. Nick story is about the time that he punched an Arian heretic in the mouth, I'm sorry. We actually don't have any evidence that happens. That was created in the Middle Ages. Now, he is said to have died on December 6th, and this became his feast day. And because of his close proximity to Christmas, he eventually became joined to that holiday, right? This is the Advent time. In the early years of his legacy, certainly preceding our sources in the 500s, Nick was remembered as a champion of the people, and he cared for those in need, gave sacrificially, and recognized that his resources, all of our resources, are to be shared, not kept to ourselves. for the sake of the beloved community. And the legend that speaks most to this is the one most famously attributed to him. And that one I am going to talk about. There once was a man who had 3 daughters. He had spent all of his resources on wild spending, foolish choices. And amongst the funds that he had was the money that he needed for 3 dowries, one for each daughter. And these days, not only were women seen as the property of men, transferred from the father to the husband, I know, it's horrible, but the father had to pay the husband to cover that new hungry mouth that he was going to have to feed. I listened to a podcast where every once in a while the guy will say the past was the worst. And I have a bone to pick with him on that. There's a lot of stuff the past was pretty good on. This is not one of them. But there were such slim options for women back in this world, right? And now that the father had spent all of this money, the girls were facing 2 possible futures that they did not want. They could be sold into slavery. They could be prostitutes. Unlike in our world today, in the US, prostitution was a legal career path, okay? It's just not one that most women wanted to do. Now, as bad news often does, it traveled. And the plight of this family became the talk of the town. And eventually, it entered the ears of Nicholas of Myra, and he created a plan. He wanted to help deliver this family from such a fate. He did not look at the situation and say, well, you know, this is what they get. If the father wouldn't have spent all that money, they would be okay. He didn't just pray about it. He set out to do something about it. But he didn't want to get any credit for it, and he wanted to preserve the dignity of each one of those girls. So he went out at night, walked over to their window, and saw their shoes on the inside of their house, sitting by that window. And he dropped enough gold in the oldest daughter's shoe to pay her dowry. And after she was married, he came by again and dropped enough gold in the second daughter's shoes to cover her dowry. And then, after that, the father knew that he wanted to meet this mysterious benefactor. And so he stayed up all night. And wouldn't you know it, here comes Nicholas, his hand through the window, dropping in the gold into the youngest daughter's shoes. And he is embraced by this father. Nicholas begs the man, don't tell anybody about this. They don't need to know this. I don't want them to know that I've been doing this. But the father is so excited, he feels like he has to tell everybody. Now, this is said to be the reason that we exchange gifts on Christmas. We have this tradition. And it's the reason that we hang up stockings, because as the story went to different cultures, shoes, which I'm sure were sandals, transformed into different kinds of footwear, until eventually you had a giant stocking hanging up by the fireplace. Now, scholars say that this is most likely an exaggerated story, but many believe that there is a kernel of truth in it. And I find a lot of joy in this story. St. Nicholas was celebrated as an example worth following. Before many of these other legendary layers were tossed on top of him, you had this story as a shorthand to explain not only his character, but the character we ought to be pursuing, where we embrace our neighbors as part of the beloved community, where we seek to help others, not so we get any kind of credit or glory or clout, but we simply just help them and do so in such a way that preserves their dignity, that treats them with respect and honor. And we don't get bogged down by the merit of what we share. We care less about whether or not a household deserves it, and we care more about whether or not needs are being met. That is a story I find joy in. That's a story I find life in. And so, my hope is when we see jolly old St. Nick around us this Christmas season, and when we think of him in the months to come, we think of the challenge of St. Nicholas, where we go and do likewise. Please pray with me. God, help us to stand in solidarity with you as you stand with the brokenhearted, the marginalized, the just-seeking, the merciful. Help us not to squander the opportunities you give us to join you in blessing others. And as we do so, help us to care more for their dignity than our agendas. Amen. Go in peace. Enjoy some baked goods